The historicity of Jesus. It is perhaps not an exaggeration to say that the world today is defined by the story and stature of Jesus Christ. As the basis for Christianity, a religion practiced by 2 billion people, as well as a key part of Islam, he is undoubtedly the most influential single figure in human history. But did he exist? A cursory search online will yield the information that, quote, most historians agree that he probably did exist, end quote. This is presented as settled fact on Wikipedia and elsewhere, so you'd imagine it would be trivial to dredge up the apparent evidence to support this. However, the more you look, the less you will find. Our primary knowledge of Jesus comes from the 4 Gospels in the Bible: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. These stories are the foundation stone on which the entirety of Christianity rests. We then learn more about his apparent teachings from the Apostle Paul, who wrote several additional books in the New Testament. There are 2 giant problems with these sources. Firstly, they were written decades after Jesus lived, 50 to 100 years later, in Greek, not Aramaic. We don't know who the writers were, but we know with certainty that they had never met Jesus and were not his contemporaries. Theoretical pre-existing books or writings are postulated to explain both the gap and the language difference. Secondly, we do not have existing first-generation copies of these texts. In fact, the oldest full copies of these books come from 300 years after they were written. In the period between the original writing and those ancient copies, countless generations of copying, recopying, and recopying again took place, by Christians who had every incentive to embellish the text to better suit their theological ends, to say nothing of the extent to which these stories were conveyed by oral tradition rather than written text at all. Even if we were to grant the accuracy of these texts, that they are faithful copies of the originals, there are endemic problems with them. The 4 books flatly contradict each other. In numerous places, on numerous key events in Jesus' life, they are also clearly and obviously theological documents, not historical ones. There is no evidence, how could there be, that he rose from the dead or was born to a virgin mother, or that he turned water into wine. And indeed, many of these stories appear to have been added by Christian clerics in the centuries after the church was founded. So the Gospels do nothing for the history. At best, they are unreliable stories that were passed around Iron Age Palestine. So what other evidence exists? Well, Paul mentions in Galatians that James, the brother of the Lord, was the only other apostle he met. Paul's authorship is a lot more authenticated than that of the Gospels, and so perhaps lends some credence to the idea that Jesus was real. That said, who's to say whether brother meant an actual blood relation, and not just a follower, or whether indeed these same 300-year delayed manuscripts are any more trustworthy? Aside from this, there are no other contemporary writings that mention Jesus at all. Josephus mentions him, but is writing a full century later, and part of that writing is a provable forgery. This was regarded for centuries as the best evidence in support of the claim, and the fact that it turned out to be mostly a fake tells you all you need to know about the veracity of these claims. So what are we left with? There are 2 arguments commonly advanced in favor of him being real. The first, the existence of an entire movement, church, and religion based on him would seem to suggest that he was real. Otherwise, who were people following? Whose life inspired the rise of Christianity? The second, the so-called embarrassment argument. This holds that the Gospels relay stories about Christ that are not all flattering, and that seems to fit better with a true story than one purely made up for theological purposes. These are both almost too weak to expend effort arguing against. On the first point, I offer you QAnon, one of the more recent examples of a mass movement having sprung up around a totally imaginary person. Millions of people were drawn into that one, and it's only because of the internet and the paucity of modern attention spans that it didn't become a multi-century global phenomenon. I'm sure you can think of your own favorite example of a fiction that led to vast mass belief. How about the gods of ancient Rome? Does anyone think Zeus really existed? On the second point, that's an attempt to psychoanalyze ancient peoples by modern standards. It's true that to us, telling unflattering stories about Jesus may seem odd, but the writers may simply have decided that was how they wanted to tell his story, or that those details were needed to fulfill prophecy, or one of any number of other reasons that would have motivated a scribe at the time. At best, this is a curiosity. It is hardly evidence. And so, in these few pages, I haven't dismantled the entirety of the Christian myth, but I have been able to demonstrate just how thin, almost non-existent, the support for the historical Jesus actually is. It is obviously true that I haven't proven Jesus didn't exist. But then, the burden of proof isn't on me. We have no idea which sages and mystics were drifting around Judea 2,000 years ago, and it's a fair bet we never will. But those making extraordinary claims should produce extraordinary evidence. And taking a fair-minded and sober look at the evidence available, there is nothing. Zero. Zilch. That supports the contention that one of those figures was a man named Jesus, who was the Son of God, or anyone else. So why does this story persist? The most rigorous academic treatment of this question comes from Richard Carrier, a historian who has applied Bayesian probability theory to the question of historicity in his book, On the Historicity of Jesus, published in 2014. Carrier is notable for being credentialed within the Academy while reaching mythicist conclusions, which matters, because the standard dismissal of mythicism is that it's a fringe position held only by polemicists. Carrier demonstrates that the question is, at minimum, genuinely open, and that the mainstream consensus reflects institutional pressures, as much as evidential weight. And therein lies the answer. Jesus is an institutional fixture. His existence sits at the core of the largest religion on earth and of every theology department at every Western university on the planet. Pull that card out of the stack, and an awful lot collapses. And so, despite the evidentiary deficit, it suits everyone to say, well, he probably existed. Most likely the miracles are mythical, but we can all carry on with the important work of worshipping him and studying him. If you care about the truth, however, and you like your history to come with credible evidence, you must conclude that this is a story, with many competing versions. That fails to establish any facts,